Have you ever had one of those moments where, you're just going about your day, maybe standing on a crowded subway platform
Or
or,
just watching the evening news, yeah.
right, exactly. You're watching a major breaking news broadcast, and for just a split second, this really strange, kind of unsettling feeling washes over you.
Like everything you're looking at feels, I don't know, incredibly choreographed.
Exactly choreographed. Like the political debates on television feel like rehearsed theater.
Uh-huh. And the economic crises feel a little too perfectly timed.
Right, it's like the cultural shifts feel less like organic human evolution and way more like a carefully managed script.
And I mean, most of us just shake that feeling off, right?
Oh, absolutely. We grab our coffee, we check our emails, and we just get back to the chaotic, messy reality of normal life.
Because you have to.
Yeah, you have to. But what happens if you don't shake it off?
That's the real question.
Right. What happens if you take that fleeting feeling of living in a manufactured reality and you build an entire comprehensive worldview around it?
Well, that's exactly what we're getting into today.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are venturing into a highly complex, undeniably fascinating, and honestly intensely controversial realm.
You really are.
We're unpacking the architecture of alternative media. Specifically, we're focusing on these grand narratives about global control, hidden agendas, and the profound psychological shift of what it actually means to, quote-unquote, wake up.
And to map out this worldview, we are analyzing an incredibly detailed, highly specific source today.
Yeah, tell us about the source.
So we're looking at an extensive translated transcript from a prominent Dutch YouTube channel. It's called Lighthouse TV.
Okay, Lighthouse TV.
Yeah, and this particular broadcast features a really deep hours-long philosophical interview with a guy named Jorn Luca.
Right, he's quite well known in that space, isn't he?
He is, yeah. He's a podcaster and a major, really influential figure within the Dutch alternative media ecosystem.
Got it.
And the conversation captured in this source material, I mean, it covers a staggering amount of ground.
I bet.
It moves from dire predictions of impending global energy lockdowns and deeply cynical analyses of international geopolitics.
Heavy stuff.
Very heavy. All the way down to the highly personal internal journey of trauma healing, physical fitness, and community building.
Wow, so it runs the whole gamut.
It really does. It's essentially a comprehensive blueprint of a very specific way of seeing the modern world.
Okay, so the mission for our deep dive today is to really understand the internal logic of that blueprint.
Exactly.
Like, how do individuals operating within this specific media space take a stack of seemingly entirely disconnected global events?
Like a sudden military escalation in the Middle East, for example.
Right, or the rapid deployment of artificial intelligence.
Or a new digital age verification law in Australia.
Yeah, exactly. And even the sudden urge to buy your vegetables from a local farmer. How do they take all of that and stitch it all together into one unified, cohesive, and deeply interconnected script?
We want to understand the underlying mechanisms that connect those dots for them. How does this narrative actually function?
Right. But before we get into unpacking those mechanisms, there is something we absolutely have to do.
Yes, it is absolutely essential that I step in here to frame the parameters of this conversation for you listening.
Please do, because this is important.
The source material we are examining today contains highly politically charged content. It touches on incredibly sensitive global and domestic issues. We will be analyzing the source's profound skepticism regarding global health initiatives and vaccines, their detailed theories regarding coordinated government conspiracies, and their extremely harsh, unrelenting criticisms of major political figures.
Figures spanning both the left and the right wings, it's worth noting.
Exactly, spanning both sides of the traditional political spectrum. And it is crucial to understand that we are not taking a side on any of these issues.
Never.
Nor are we endorsing or validating these viewpoints. Our sole purpose in this analysis is to impartially report on the ideas contained in the original source material.
Right. We are just the messengers here.
We are here to act as objective guides, mapping out the narrative being presented so that you can clearly understand the framework and the logic of this specific worldview. Nothing more and nothing less.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I want to start at the foundational layer of this source.
The psychology of it all.
Exactly. Before it gets into geopolitics or economics, the entire interview is anchored in a profound psychological and philosophical concept.
Right. It's all framed around this single and incredibly potent metaphor for the modern human experience.
The visceral feeling of living inside a meticulously constructed set.
Yeah, and to illustrate this, the source relies heavily on a piece of late 90s pop culture that has basically become a foundational text in these
A
circles.
1998 Jim Carrey film, The Truman Show.
Yes, they frame the entire awakening process around this movie. It serves as a brilliant cinematic shorthand for the complex psychological state they are trying to describe.
The influence of this film is so profound that Jorn Luca actually named his own platform and podcast The Truman Show, didn't he?
He did, yeah. And during the Lighthouse TV interview, they dedicate significant time to dissecting the climactic final scene of that exact movie.
Right, so for anyone who might be unfamiliar with the plot, let's recap quickly. The film follows Truman Burbank, a guy who has lived his entire life inside a massive, enclosed, technologically advanced dome.
A literal television set.
Exactly. And unbeknownst to him, everyone he has ever met, his friends, his wife, his coworkers, they are all paid actors.
Everything is scripted.
Every single event in his life, from the weather to his daily interactions, is tightly managed by a television network.
And then we get to that final resolving scene.
Yeah, the boat scene. Truman finally overcomes his engineered fear of water. He gets into a small sailboat, and he sets off across what he believes is the open ocean.
Desperate to find the truth of his reality.
Right, and then the ultimate psychological fracture occurs. The bow of his sailboat literally pierces the painted sky.
He hits a physical, solid wall.
And the sound design of that moment in the film is just, it's what makes it so visceral. You just hear this dull, hollow thud.
Yeah, it's chilling.
The sky, which represents infinite possibility and natural reality, is revealed to be a piece of fiberglass.
And so Truman steps out of his boat, walks along this narrow painted ledge, and he finds a staircase that leads to an exit door labeled Freedom.
And as he opens that door to step into the dark, unknown real world, he is finally confronted by the creator of his reality.
A television producer named Christoph, who speaks to him over a booming intercom system from a control room in the quote-unquote sun.
And Christoph desperately tries to convince Truman to stay. He argues that the real world is sick, chaotic, and dangerous.
Right, he says there is no more truth out there than there is inside the manufactured safety of the dome. He's begging him to remain in the scripted illusion.
So how does Jorn Luca map this specific cinematic confrontation to the real world?
Well, it's a highly analytical comparison. He explicitly compares Truman's realization to his own personal experience during the initial 2020 COVID-19 lockdowns.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, he describes a period where his businesses were shut down, the societal rules he relied on were completely inverted overnight.
The ground was pulled out from under him.
Exactly. And in that moment of profound systemic crisis, he experienced his own version of hitting the painted wall.
He started seeing the glitches.
Right. He states that he began to perceive the world not as an organic, randomly evolving place, but as a decor.
A decor, like a stage set.
A carefully constructed set, yeah. A scripted, bad movie where the government, the media, and global financial institutions didn't have the public's best interests at heart.
Right, but we're actively managing the population like characters in a show.
Exactly.
But the source makes a really striking point about the aftermath of that realization. Because hitting the wall isn't the end of the hero's journey, is it?
No, it's actually a brutal, destabilizing beginning.
Right. When an individual realizes the sky is painted, they don't just peacefully walk out the exit door and start a new life. They experience profound psychological shock.
The immediate internal monologue becomes this terrifying questioning of literally everything. Like, if this is fake, what else is fake?
Have I been systematically fooled my entire life?
Yeah, and according to the source material, the moment you begin to express these doubts out loud, you immediately encounter massive, organized resistance.
But that resistance doesn't just come from the creators of the system, does it?
No, and this is the kicker. The most painful resistance actually comes from your fellow citizens.
Wow. Okay, so how do they explain that dynamic?
Well, the source layers another famous piece of science fiction over the Truman Show metaphor to explain the societal resistance. They bring in the concept of Agent Smiths from the 1999 film The Matrix.
Oh, right, the guys in the black suits.
Exactly. In the original film, Agent Smiths are sentient computer programs designed to police the artificial reality and eliminate anyone who questions the system.
But I'm guessing in this alternative media framework, an Agent Smith isn't a literal government operative in a suit.
Right. In Jorn Luca's narrative, an Agent Smith is your next-door neighbor. It's your oldest friend. It's your family member sitting across from you at the dinner table.
So it's a completely regular person.
A completely regular person who is so deeply psychologically invested in the illusion, so comfortable in the predictability of the manufactured reality, that they will actively and aggressively fight to pull you back into it.
I mean, the psychology behind that is fascinating. It's essentially an extreme manifestation of cognitive dissonance, isn't it?
Exactly what it is.
Because if you tell your friend that the world they trust is actually a predatory scripted illusion, you're not just insulting the system.
No, you're threatening their fundamental sense of safety.
Right. For their worldview to remain intact, they have to pathologize your awakening. They have to label you as crazy or radicalized or conspiracy theorist.
Because the alternative, the idea that you are right and they have been living a lie, is just too terrifying for them to process.
Which creates this intense, immediate social friction. And the source maps this friction perfectly to clinical human psychology.
Yeah, Jorn explicitly links this awakening process to the Kubler-Ross model of the 5 stages of grief.
Oh, that makes so much sense. You lose your fundamental understanding of reality, so your brain is forced to mourn it.
Right, you cycle through denial and bargaining, but the phase the source focuses on most heavily is anger.
The anger phase.
Yeah, Jorn describes how initially, when you see through the decor, you become consumed with an extreme, almost blinding rage.
And I assume that rage translates into a desperate, overwhelming urge to grab everyone around you and forcefully shake them awake.
Exactly. You want to preach at them. You want to yell from the rooftops, look at the wall, the sky is fake, the news is lying to you.
Which is, I mean, that instinct to warn the collective is deeply ingrained in our evolutionary biology, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. When an individual believes they've discovered a life-saving truth or uncovered a massive predatory deception threatening the group, the biological urgency to sound the alarm is practically hardwired into our nervous systems.
But the interview provides a very critical, highly self-aware reflection on this phase, doesn't it?
It does. Jorn admits that he spent a significant amount of time trapped in that anger phase, alienating people by trying to aggressively force them to see the geopolitical and social glitches he was seeing.
And he eventually realized that this approach is entirely counterproductive. Which, if we look at why that aggressive approach fails so spectacularly, it makes perfect sense.
Right.
Like, why does the natural instinct to shake someone awake trigger such massive pushback, even if your intentions are genuinely good?
Well, how do you think about it?
I think about it like being in a movie theater. Imagine you are watching a complex mystery thriller, and because you pay really close attention to the subtle clues, you figure out the massive twist ending in the first 15 minutes.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Right. And you turn to the person sitting next to you, who is happily eating their popcorn, totally engrossed in the suspense of the narrative.
And you just scream the twist ending directly into their face.
Exactly. You scream it in their face. You might think you're doing them a favor by giving them the truth, but in reality, you're just ruining their experience.
You're forcefully ripping them out of a narrative they were willingly participating in.
Yes, you are demanding they engage with the reality of the movie on your terms, completely disrespecting their own timeline of discovery. And that just generates immediate resentment and massive resistance.
That analogy captures the exact social dynamic Jorn Luca describes.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the source details how Jorn recognized that staying that frequency of persistent anger and constantly preaching to unwilling audiences not only ruins relationships, but it actually feeds the very control system he's trying to dismantle.
Oh, that's an interesting twist. How does it feed the system?
The underlying theory here is that the manufactured system thrives on division, social friction, and low-frequency emotional states like fear and rage.
Ah, I see.
So if you are constantly enraged, constantly fighting with your neighbor about the news, you are still reacting to the script provided by the creators.
You're still letting the external architecture dictate your internal emotional state.
Exactly. You are a different kind of predictable actor, but you're still on the set.
Wow. Okay, so if forcing people awake just triggers their psychological defenses and feeds the division the system relies on, the logical pivot for someone in this space has to be abandoning the attempt to change the external world, right?
Right, and focusing entirely on the internal. You have to stop preaching and start building something else.
Is that the pivot this source describes?
It is exactly the pivot they describe. The interview details how Jorn moved his focus away from just shouting about globalist agendas and World Economic Forum policies, and he pivoted heavily toward inner work.
Like what kind of inner work?
He began focusing on trauma, healing, self-development, and spiritual awareness. He came to the profound realization that that you absolutely cannot force anyone's psychological timeline.
Which goes right back to the Truman Show. Truman's awakening wasn't a sudden event. It was a slow, agonizing, highly personal process of noticing tiny, incremental glitches over years.
Right, a falling stage light, a strange pattern in the traffic.
Exactly. No one burst into his house, pinned him down, and slapped him with the truth.
And in fact, the movie explicitly shows what happens when someone tries to force the truth too early.
Oh, the scene with the intruder.
Yeah, there's a scene where a man who managed to sneak onto the set, who we later find out is Truman's father, who was written off the show.
Right.
He tries to break through the crowd and tell Truman what is happening. The security guards drag him away, and Truman, rather than realizing the truth, just rationalizes it as a bizarre, random encounter with a homeless person.
Because he wasn't psychologically ready to process the breach in his reality.
Precisely the point the source is making. Recognizing this limitation, Jorn redefined his role within the alternative media space.
So what is his new role?
He sees his platform not as a battering ram to break down the doors of people who are happily asleep, but as a beacon for those who have already found the door themselves.
A validating space.
Exactly, a stabilizing space. When an individual in the real world finally notices their own glitch in the matrix, when they start questioning the official narrative of a geopolitical event or an economic policy,
They look around and often feel entirely isolated.
right. So Jorn's message to them is, you are not crazy. You are not alone. There are hundreds of thousands of us who see the painted wall too.
It's about providing the necessary vocabulary, the philosophical framework, and a sense of community for the already waking, rather than antagonizing those who aren't ready to look up.
Exactly.
I think this is a highly relatable psychological concept to reflect on, regardless of where you fall on the spectrum of believing in grand global conspiracies.
Oh, definitely.
Just think about your own life. Have you ever had a major paradigm shift? Maybe you suddenly realized a long-term relationship was fundamentally toxic, or you recognize that the career path you spent a decade pursuing was making you miserable.
Or you completely changed a core political or religious belief.
Right. Think about how incredibly isolating it feels when you undergo that profound internal shift. But everyone around you is still operating on your old software. You feel like you are speaking a foreign language.
And the urge to make them understand your new reality is overwhelming.
But the realization that you can only control your own perception and that you must allow others to walk their own path represents the true final stage of grief, which is acceptance.
Acceptance of the individual journey is a crucial psychological baseline. But, and this is important, the source material does not stop at internal acceptance.
Right, because once an individual within this worldview has accepted that the decor of society is a manufactured set, the immediate pressing question shifts from the internal to the external.
If this is a tightly managed script, what exactly is the director planning next?
What is the next major scene being written for the global population?
Exactly. And that moves us from the psychological foundation to the tangible geopolitical threats perceived by the source.
So if the world is a constructed set, what is the next crisis being engineered? According to this Lighthouse TV broadcast, the next major act of the play is already in pre-production.
And the trailers are starting to air.
What's the prediction?
The overarching prediction made by the source is the imminent arrival of what they term climate lockdowns, or energy lockdowns.
Energy lockdowns. Wow.
They argue that the immense, unprecedented infrastructure of societal control that was established and normalized during the COVID-19 pandemic is about to be dusted off, rebranded, and repurposed for a new, permanent state of emergency.
Do they point to specific signals to substantiate that?
They point to very specific contemporary signals. The interview extensively highlights a message that gained significant traction on the social media platform X, posted by an account known as Hogsy Insider.
Which translates to the Hague Insider, right? Because The Hague is the political heart of the Netherlands.
Exactly, where the government and parliament are seated. This account claimed to have leaked information from a highly classified, high-level government briefing.
And what did the briefing detail?
Severe upcoming societal restrictions aimed at radically curbing citizen consumption due to an engineered energy crisis.
How drastic are we talking?
Incredibly drastic. They echo the austerity measures of the past, but framed within a modern, climate-focused context. We are looking at proposals for significantly lowered national speed limits.
Okay, that's somewhat common.
Sure, but also the reinstatement of mandatory car-free Sundays, which hasn't been seen in the Netherlands since the 1973 oil crisis.
Oh, wow. Car-free Sundays.
And heavy restrictions or even outright legislative bans on short-haul commercial flights.
So the core focus of all these proposed measures is a rapid, forced acceleration of the energy transition away from fossil fuels.
Driven not by organic market forces, but by state mandate.
And the source doesn't just rely on anonymous internet leaks to build this narrative, do they?
You know, they argue that this agenda is being openly broadcast in the rhetoric of actual elected officials.
Who do they point to?
The broadcast plays an audio clip of Rob Jetten. He's a prominent Dutch politician and the former Minister for Climate and Energy Policy.
What does he say in the clip?
In this clip, Jetten explicitly links the escalating military conflict in Iran and the resulting destabilization of the Strait of Hormuz directly to the surging energy prices impacting European citizens.
Okay, standard geopolitical analysis so far.
Right. He warns the public that this geopolitical crisis could have devastating, long-lasting structural effects on the global economy. But the crucial part of his rhetoric, according to the source, is how he uses this fear.
How does he use it?
He uses the threat of the Middle Eastern conflict to argue that European nations must push the green energy transition forward at, quote, full force.
And this is where the source's analytical framework really begins to invert the mainstream narrative, isn't it?
Completely.
Because to the average viewer watching the evening news, the narrative presented by politicians like Jetten is linear, logical, and tragic.
Right.
It goes like this. There is a deeply unfortunate, spontaneous war in the Middle East. Because the Strait of Hormuz is a massive choke point for global oil shipping, this war disrupts supply lines.
Therefore, oil becomes scarce and expensive.
Therefore, we as a society must find alternative green energy sources to survive this difficult period. Cause, effect, and a necessary solution.
But the source looks at that exact same sequence of events and sees a highly coordinated sleight of hand. Yeah, they argue that the rising energy prices and the geopolitical instability are absolutely not the accidental byproducts of a distant, unpredictable war.
They claim it's a deliberate, meticulously manufactured crisis designed to achieve a specific domestic policy goal.
Exactly. What's fascinating here is how the source breaks down the economics. They argue that if governments genuinely, sincerely cared about the extreme financial suffering of the working and middle classes at the gas pump, they possess an immediate stroke of a pen solution.
A solution that requires no new technology and no grand transition.
Right. They could simply lower taxes.
Ah.
The interview points out the economic reality that in places like the Netherlands, well over 50% of the price of a liter of fuel at the pump is comprised of value-added tax and government excise duties.
Over 50%.
And that money flows straight into the treasury.
The logic here is incredibly sharp. The source is saying, if this was truly a national emergency where the government's primary goal was to protect the economic stability of its citizens, they would immediately slash the tax rate to stabilize the price of fuel.
But they do not do that.
Why not?
Because, according to Joran Luca's analysis, the government actually wants the prices to be excruciatingly high.
So the economic pain is not a side effect.
The pain is the entire point.
Wow.
The high prices function as a punitive mechanism. They are being used to forcefully disincentivize the use of fossil fuels, bankrupting citizens to the point where they have no choice but to accept the green transition.
Buy electric vehicles they cannot afford and accept permanently reduced mobility.
Exactly. And the source views this strategy through a deeply historical lens, specifically analyzing the global response to the COVID-19 pandemic as the ultimate blueprint for this new style of governance.
You're right. They see a through line there.
They do. The broadcast includes a revealing audio clip from 2020 featuring Joe Biden.
Oh, what did he say?
In the clip, Biden explicitly draws a parallel between the two crises. He states that just as the nation required a unified national response to combat COVID-19,
which entailed unprecedented lockdowns, mandates, and economic interventions.
Exactly. He says it now requires a similarly unified, totalizing national response to combat climate change. He utilizes the ubiquitous political slogan, "Build Back Better," and speaks openly about seizing the unique opportunity presented by a global crisis.
Seizing the opportunity. That concept is the absolute crux of the alternative media worldview, isn't it?
It really is. It relies on the infamous political adage attributed to Rahm Emanuel. You never want a serious crisis to go to waste.
Right, I've heard that. But the force takes that Machiavellian concept a step further, don't they?
Much further. They don't just believe that governments opportunistically use organic crises to pass unpopular legislation. They believe the crises are actively engineered from their inception to be utilized as tools for societal transformation.
It's like a magician's sleight of hand. making the audience look at a foreign war so they don't notice their pockets being picked at the gas pump.
That's a great way to put it. Exploring how these crises function mechanically reveals a dual purpose within this narrative. First, the crisis generates enough public fear to allow for the rapid implementation of dystopian legal restrictions.
Like the lockdowns, digital tracking, or forced consumption limits.
Things that a democratic public would vehemently reject under normal, peaceful circumstances.
And what's the second purpose?
Second, and perhaps more crucially from an economic standpoint, these engineered crises act as massive, highly efficient wealth transfer mechanisms.
Okay, let's drill down into the mechanics of that wealth transfer, because it is not just a vague idea of rich people getting richer. It is a specific structural critique.
Right. When a crisis hits, whether it's a pandemic requiring millions of vaccines and business bailouts, or an energy crisis requiring a massive overhaul of the national grid, governments must generate capital.
They do this through taxation, or, more commonly, through massive deficit spending and inflationary money printing.
And the source argues that this newly created money does not flow downward to the citizens who are suffering. It flows directly upward.
The middle class pays the hidden tax of inflation at the grocery store.
While billions in government contracts, subsidies, and grants are funneled directly into the hands of the pharmaceutical industry, defense contractors, and massive asset management firms like BlackRock.
Because they are positioned to build the new green infrastructure.
It's the Cantillon effect, weaponized on a global scale.
The Cantillon effect, right, where the first people to receive the newly printed money benefit and everyone else suffers from the resulting inflation.
Exactly. The source describes this as an ordinary systemic theft of assets from the bottom layer of society. The working class loses their small businesses during a lockdown, or they can't afford the massive carbon compliance costs during an energy crisis, forcing them to sell their assets.
And who buys those assets?
The massive multinational corporations who receive the government bailouts. The wealth of the middle class is systematically harvested by the elite.
So the source claims we're watching the exact same playbook from 2020 being run again today, just with a different coat of paint.
Essentially, yes. Instead of a microscopic virus justifying the restrictions, it's a macroeconomic war and an energy shortage.
But the mathematical result is identical. The military-industrial complex receives massive funding to secure the supply chains.
Vast corporate entities reap the benefits of state-mandated energy transitions.
The middle class is pushed closer to poverty due to crushing inflation.
And the state gains unprecedented surveillance and control over individual movement under the unassailable moral guise of saving the planet.
It is a staggering, deeply cynical view of how the global power structure operates. It implies that almost nothing on the geopolitical stage is organic or accidental. Every war, every shortage, every pandemic is viewed as a lever being pulled by a hidden director.
Yes, which leads us to a massive, glaring question that anyone listening to this must ask.
Right. If all these crises are manufactured by a hidden elite, who exactly is writing this script? And why can't the traditional political system, the democratic process of voting in new leaders, step in, expose the corruption, and fix it?
Well, this is where the source dives into a profound, almost absolute form of political nihilism.
Oh, boy.
They completely dismiss the entire theater of global politics. Elections, debates, partisan bickering, they view all of it as a carefully managed illusion of choice.
So they argue that the politicians we see on television are not the ones turning the dials of power. They are merely the actors cast to read the lines.
Exactly. Let's start with their analysis of the Middle East because it's highly relevant to the energy crisis we just discussed.
Okay.
The source, Joran Luca, explicitly and adamantly states that the escalating conflict involving Iran has absolutely nothing to do with the stated Western goals of bringing democracy to the region, fighting terrorism, or protecting human rights.
I mean, they view the Western diplomatic rhetoric regarding the moral dangers of certain foreign regimes as pure, unadulterated hypocrisy. Right.
Yes. To illustrate this, Joran points to domestic failings within Western democracies. He specifically references the Dutch childcare benefits scandal.
Right. That was a massive governmental failure, where the Dutch tax authority falsely accused tens of thousands of families of fraud,
Driving many into profound poverty, destroying marriages, and ruining lives. And the source uses this domestic tragedy to highlight the absurdity of Western moral posturing abroad.
The argument is, how can a government claim to be dropping bombs in the Middle East to protect human rights when it routinely destroys the lives of its own citizens through bureaucratic malice at home?
Exactly. And to substantiate the monumental claim that the conflict with Iran is a pre-written script rather than a spontaneous dispute, the source references a very specific, highly controversial historical artifact.
What's the artifact?
They point to public statements made by retired U.S. General Wesley Clark shortly after the September 11 attacks.
Oh, the famous memo.
Right. In a famous interview, Clark claimed that he visited the Pentagon and was shown a classified memo from the Office of the Secretary of Defense.
And according to Clark, this memo outlined a staggering military plan to take out the governments of 7 sovereign countries in a span of just 5 years.
The list started with Iraq, moved through Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and ended, ultimately, with Iran.
7 countries in 5 years.
Now, the source readily acknowledges that the original timeline of the memo was obviously delayed by the messy realities of the Iraq War. However, they view the current unfolding escalation with Iran not as a new, spontaneous geopolitical flare-up caused by recent events,
But as the final, inevitable execution of a script that was drafted by the military-industrial complex over 2 decades ago.
yes. In this worldview, the war is not a tragic failure of diplomacy. It is a highly functional tool designed specifically to trigger the energy crisis.
Which in turn justifies the climate lockdowns, which in turn facilitates the wealth transfer. It is a perfectly closed loop of logic.
It really is. Now, the source's deep skepticism of the establishment is expected. It's normal for alternative media to criticize the military-industrial complex or politicians like Joe Biden, but the analysis does not stop at traditional establishment figures. And this is perhaps the most surprising, nuanced, and counterintuitive part of the entire Lighthouse TV interview. We have to look closely at their incredibly harsh critique of Donald Trump.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. Because if you look at alternative media broadly, especially in the United States, but also globally, Donald Trump is very frequently positioned as the great disruptor.
Right, the ultimate outsider.
He is viewed as the populist savior who is actively fighting the entrenched deep state on behalf of the forgotten working class. He is the hero of the counter-narrative.
But Jorn Luca and the Lighthouse TV hosts utterly and completely reject that narrative.
They do.
They view Trump not as a rebel fighting against the globalist script, but as a crucial, highly effective, and deeply embedded actor within it.
Wow, okay, so the analysis of Trump within this source is methodical and rooted in policy, not personality,
Yep,
right?
exactly. Jorn lists specific, undeniable historical evidence to argue that Trump is fundamentally part of the globalist machinery. First, he points directly to the response to the pandemic, specifically Operation Warp Speed.
Oh, right.
While a massive segment of Trump's populist base in the alternative space is highly skeptical of or outright hostile toward the mRNA vaccines, Jorn points out the inconvenient truth that Trump was the primary architect of their rapid, unprecedented rollout.
Trump poured billions of taxpayer dollars into the pharmaceutical companies and frequently boasts about the speed of the vaccine development as one of his greatest achievements.
And because the source actively blames these specific vaccines for ongoing global excess mortality, they view Trump's pride and complicity in their creation as a massive, unforgivable red flag.
He funded the very medical intervention the alternative media warns against.
Building on that, the source highlights Trump's deep systemic ties to technocratic surveillance architecture.
Like what?
They specifically mention his administration's close relationship with Palantir.
That's the massive data analytics company founded by Peter Thiel, right? Heavily involved with military, intelligence, and predictive policing agencies worldwide.
Exactly. Jorn even refers to Trump as the AI president because of these technocratic alliances.
That completely contradicts the carefully cultivated image of Trump as a blue-collar populist fighting for the privacy and freedom of the common man against the overreach of tech elites.
In reality, the source argues he is actively funding and utilizing the very surveillance tools the elite use for control.
Furthermore, the source brings up foreign policy and international lobbying, don't they?
They do. They point to Trump's incredibly strong ties to and funding from powerful pro-Israel lobbying groups.
So the source argues that his foreign policy decisions in the Middle East, such as the Abraham Accords and the massive funding of foreign militaries, prove he is just as beholden to external international interest as any establishment Democrat or legacy Republican.
He's not putting his country first. He's playing his assigned role on the geopolitical chessboard.
Which raises a fascinating psychological question. If Trump's actual policies, funding big pharma, expanding surveillance, and catering to foreign lobbies, if they align so perfectly with the globalist machine, why is he positioned as the ultimate anti-establishment rebel?
That's the million-dollar question. Jorn Luca proposes a highly sophisticated theory regarding mass psychology and political control here. He theorizes that the installation of a deeply unpopular establishment figure like Joe Biden was essentially a deliberate psychological operation.
Wait, really? A
Oh,
psychological operation?
yeah. The idea is that an administration characterized by heavy mandates and economic inflation was designed specifically to make the public incredibly angry.
It was meant to make the working class lose total faith in the traditional system and to build up a massive, volatile reservoir of rebellious, anti-government energy.
And then, perfectly on cue, just as the pressure in the boiler is about to explode, Donald Trump is presented to the public as the ultimate solution.
He is the pressure relief valve.
Exactly. He catches all of that critical, rebellious energy, the people who were starting to wake up, the people who were starting to see the glitches in the Matrix and realize the decor of the Truman Show was fake, suddenly feel like they have a champion.
They project all of their hopes, their fears, and their desire for justice onto him. They go to his rallies, they cheer for him, they donate their money to his campaigns, and most importantly, they go back to sleep.
They stop fighting the system at a localized structural level because they genuinely believe the hero on television is going to handle it for them.
I mean, it is an incredibly profound, almost paralyzing sense of political nihilism. It suggests that the system is so advanced that it doesn't just manufacture compliance, it actively manufactures its own controlled opposition.
It is the ultimate illusion of choice.
Think about it like a teenager taking driver's education. You are sitting in the driver's seat, you have your hands tightly gripping the steering wheel, and you are staring intensely at the road ahead. You truly believe you are in total autonomous control of the vehicle.
But you're completely ignoring the fact that there is a second steering wheel on the passenger side.
Exactly, and your driving instructor has a firm grip on it. That second wheel is connected to the exact same axle as yours. Whether you angrily pull your steering wheel hard to the left or aggressively yank it to the right, the car is ultimately going exactly where the instructor wants it to go.
The political parties are just two steering wheels connected to the same globalist axle.
Which logically leads to the question the source must answer. If the game is entirely rigged, if both steering wheels go to the exact same place, why do these podcasters even bother analyzing the news? Why discuss politics at all if the outcome is predetermined theater?
Well, the source addresses this paradox directly. They argue that participating in the traditional political system, specifically the act of walking into a voting booth and casting a ballot, actually legitimizes the rigged game.
By voting, you are providing your formal consent to the illusion. You are agreeing to play a game where the dealer has stacked the deck.
Because of this, Joran suggests a radical, deeply uncomfortable alternative for the awake citizen. A massive, coordinated, total refusal to vote.
A complete and utter boycott of the democratic process.
Yes. He argues that if every single person who realized the system was fundamentally broken simply withdrew their participation entirely, the resulting astronomically low voter turnout would instantly and mathematically delegitimize the ruling government.
It would strip them of their mandate. In the source's view, a completely empty polling station is a far more powerful, disruptive, and terrifying statement to the ruling elite than millions of people begrudgingly voting for the quote-unquote lesser of two evils.
It is the ultimate act of withdrawing consent from the script.
So if we accept their premise for a moment that traditional politics is just pacifying theater and voting is a useless exercise in validating a corrupt system, then what is the actual future taking shape behind the curtain?
While the general public is completely distracted by the political circus of elections and manufactured foreign wars, what kind of world is the director of The Truman Show actually building?
Right. This brings us to a fascinating, highly complex tension within the source material itself. Because the Lighthouse TV interview actually presents two massive, seemingly contradictory visions of our immediate future.
Yeah, let's look at the first vision they outline. This is what the source ominously refers to as the digital prison.
The digital prison. The ultimate technocratic nightmare scenario.
This is the culmination of the globalist agenda they have been warning about. It is a vision of a world characterized by extreme, localized geographical control and absolute, inescapable digital surveillance.
To explain how this prison is being constructed, they cite several very real contemporary policy concepts, don't they? First, they discuss the implementation of 15-minute cities.
Yes, 15-minute cities. In mainstream urban planning, a 15-minute city is simply a neighborhood designed so that citizens can access all basic necessities, work, school, groceries within a short walk or bike ride.
It's pitched as a convenience and an environmental benefit.
But within the alternative media framework, the 15-minute city is viewed as the physical infrastructure for a lockdown. They fear these zones will eventually become mandatory, restricting freedom of movement and penalizing citizens who travel outside their designated grid in the name of reducing carbon emissions.
And what's the financial linchpin of this digital prison?
The financial linchpin is the concept of central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs.
CBDCs. The source takes time to differentiate a CBDC from the digital banking we use today, right?
Right. Currently, when you tap a credit card, you are using digital money, but it is managed by a private commercial bank. A CBDC is digital money issued directly by the central government.
And the terrifying difference, according to the source, is programmability. A CBDC allows the government to track every single microtransaction in real time.
But more than that, it allows the government to program the money itself. They could implement expiration dates on your currency to force spending and stimulate the economy.
Or, crucially tying back to the energy lockdowns we talked about, they could link your bank account directly to a personal carbon credit score.
Exactly. If you buy too much meat or put too much gas in your car, the central bank could simply restrict your ability to purchase carbon-heavy goods. Your money is no longer your own. It's an allowance contingent on your behavioral compliance.
And the final, critical piece of architecture required to lock the door of the digital prison is the digital ID.
The source brings up a highly current, insidious example of how they believe this infrastructure is being stealthily rolled out to the public. They look specifically at Australia's recent, highly publicized legislative push to ban children under the age of 16 from using social media platforms.
Now, on the surface, to a mainstream observer, this legislation looks like a perfectly reasonable, deeply necessary public health measure. It's designed to protect vulnerable children from the well-documented mental health crisis, cyberbullying, and algorithmic radicalization caused by smartphones and social media.
It sounds like a government genuinely trying to protect its youth.
It sounds incredibly noble, but the source views it as a classic textbook Trojan horse, don't they?
They absolutely do. They analyze the technical mechanics required to enforce such a law. Because to enforce a strict ban on users under 16, a platform cannot simply rely on a user checking a box that says, I am over 16.
Right, kids lie about that all the time.
You have to definitively, cryptographically prove the exact age of every single person logging onto the internet. And how do you technically achieve that on a national scale?
You mandate a digital, government-linked biometric ID to access the web.
The source argues that the Protect the Children narrative is nothing but a highly palatable, emotionally manipulative excuse used to force a mandatory digital identification grid onto the entire adult population.
Once you are required to scan a government-issued digital passport just to log on to Twitter, read the news, or access a bank account, anonymity is dead, and the digital prison's walls are fully impenetrably constructed.
So that is Vision 1, a hyper-connected, hyper-controlled, artificially intelligent panopticon powered by endless data and total state control.
But as the interview progresses, the host of the Lighthouse TV broadcast introduces Vision 2, and this is where the narrative becomes highly complex and almost paradoxical.
They play a lengthy audio clip from a Tucker Carlson interview featuring a popular internet geopolitical analyst known as Professor J.
Right. Professor J is a Chinese history teacher who has gained massive online traction for his stark predictions regarding global macroeconomic shifts.
And Professor J's predictions paint a radically different picture of the future, one driven primarily by the severe physical realities of the energy crisis we discussed earlier.
He does not see a high-tech future of AI surveillance. He outlines three massive, inevitable, and fundamentally retrograde macro trends that will define the next decade.
Let's unpack the mechanics of Professor J's three trends. Trend number 1 is deindustrialization.
Okay, to understand this, we have to look at how modern society functions. Professor J argues that the modern phenomenon of massive populations living in concrete megacities is an unnatural state.
A state that is entirely 100% dependent on the continuous, uninterrupted importation of cheap fossil fuels and cheap, mass-produced food.
Right. Modern agriculture relies heavily on the Haber-Bosch process, using natural gas to create the synthetic fertilizers that feed billions.
But once the era of cheap energy ends, which the source believes is happening right now due to the scripted conflicts in the Middle East and the punitive climate taxes,
the agricultural supply chains collapse. Crop yields plummet. Food becomes incredibly scarce and unaffordable.
the cities, which produce nothing but consume massive amounts of energy, become unsustainable death traps.
Therefore, humanity will be violently forced to deindustrialize. We will see a massive, desperate demographic shift out of the cities and a forced return to agrarian life.
Simply because people will have to farm the land by hand to secure enough calories to survive.
That is a staggering vision.
It is, and
Well,
trend number 2 builds on that global instability: remilitarization.
because for the last 80 years, we've lived under the umbrella of Pax Americana, a global order where the United States Navy essentially acted as the undisputed global police force.
Securing the oceans and preventing major regional conflicts to ensure free trade.
But Professor Jay argues that era is definitively over. The U.S. military is overextended, economically drained, and is no longer viewed as an invincible deterrent by rival nations.
Because the U.S. can no longer guarantee the safety of global shipping lanes, nations that previously relied entirely on the American umbrella for their survival, like Japan or Germany, will be forced to rapidly rebuild their own massive standing militaries.
To protect their regional interests in a newly hostile, fragmented world.
Which perfectly triggers trend number 3, mercantilism, or the death of global free trade.
Because global shipping lanes are no longer secure, and because energy shortages are permanently disrupting international manufacturing, the hyper-efficient global supply chains we rely on will shatter.
Advanced industrial nations can no longer rely on importing cheap microchips from Taiwan or cheap raw materials from Africa. They will be forced to pivot to mercantilism.
They will have to build localized, completely self-sufficient, fiercely protected, and independent supply chains entirely within their own borders or immediate geographic regions. The era of a seamlessly connected global economy is ending.
Now, the structural logic behind Professor Jay's trends is sound, but it creates a massive intellectual collision within the source material.
Yes, I have to point out the glaring contradiction here. How can these two visions, the digital prison and deindustrialization,
Right.
possibly coexist in the same reality?
It's a huge paradox.
The source just spent significant time warning us about the elite building a flawless, high-tech, AI-driven digital prison utilizing central bank digital currencies and biometric tracking grids.
But Professor Jay is explicitly arguing that the world is rapidly running out of the cheap energy required to power industrial society. Globalization is dying, and we are going to be forced back into the fields to farm with our hands just to eat.
Exactly. How can the global elite possibly run a massive, server-heavy, AI-controlled surveillance state if there is not enough cheap energy left on the grid to keep the lights on?
You can't.
You cannot enforce a digital programmable currency if the power goes out. You cannot have a high-tech digital prison in a world that has been forcefully deindustrialized.
It is the ultimate paradox. And it's the exact unresolvable contradiction that the hosts of the Lighthouse TV interview stumble into. They grapple with this paradox live on air.
And the conclusion they arrive at is truly fascinating because it requires them to admit a fundamental weakness in the system they've spent hours describing as omnipotent.
They admit that the script might not actually go exactly to the director's plan.
The illusion might break. The driving instructor might lose control of the wheel.
Precisely. They acknowledge that while the global elite might be aggressively trying to implement the energy lockdowns and carbon taxes as a mechanism to force the population into the digital prison, they are playing with fire.
The resulting chaos, the actual physical loss of baseline energy, the catastrophic breakdown of agricultural supply chains, the geopolitical fracturing, it might spiral completely and violently out of their centralized control.
The system is just too complex to manage perfectly.
So the control system might accidentally cannibalize its own foundational infrastructure.
Yes. And here is the truly surprising, almost optimistic twist in the source's logic. They suggest that this terrifying period of chaos, this forced return to local farming and harsh deindustrialization predicted by Professor Jay, might actually be the very mechanism that inadvertently saves humanity from the digital prison.
Wait, really? That is an incredible thought. The cure for the technocratic surveillance state is the total collapse of the physical infrastructure required to support it.
Exactly. If the global supply chains break down, you cannot order cheap goods from Amazon. You have to rely on the craftsman down the street.
If the central electrical grid fails due to energy shortages, the servers running the central bank digital currency go dark.
And people will naturally revert to bartering with gold, silver, or locally grown food.
While the transition sounds terrifying, brutal, and chaotic, the source sees a strange, purifying silver lining in the collapse. It forces a harsh but necessary return to physical, analog reality.
It breaks the decor of the Truman Show not by exposing the lie, but by making the screens go completely black.
That represents a massive, unexpected pivot in the tone of the interview. After spending hours meticulously detailing this inescapable, multi-layered web of global control, economic theft, media manipulation, and political theater, you would assume the logical conclusion for anyone absorbing this worldview would be a state of absolute crushing despair.
But that is not where Luca lands at all.
Not at all. And this brings us to the final and arguably the most practically applicable theme of the source material: the profound emphasis on personal agency and the aggressive rejection of the black pill.
For listeners who might not be deeply immersed in internet culture and its various lexicons, what exactly does it mean to take the black pill?
In the sociology of the internet, taking the black pill is the adoption of a philosophy of extreme, paralyzing fatalism. It is a state of total nihilism.
It is the core belief that the systems of control are so deeply entrenched, so wealthy, so technologically advanced, and fundamentally so evil that absolutely nothing a single individual does can possibly matter.
It's the belief that humanity is entirely doomed, the digital prison is inevitable, and the only logical response is to give up, detach, and wait for the end.
It is absolute surrender, and Luca actively, vehemently rejects this philosophy. He states clearly that he is the furthest thing from being black-pilled.
Which on the surface sounds contradictory. How do you look at a world where you firmly believe your money is being systematically stolen to fund foreign wars, where you believe every major politician is a compromised actor reading a script, and where you believe a biometric digital prison is actively being built around you, and not succumb to total hopelessness?
He avoids that psychological trap by fundamentally shifting his entire paradigm of action. He argues that the very act of sitting around and waiting for an external savior, whether that savior is Donald Trump, a new populist political party, a sudden mass awakening of the general public, or even a divine intervention, is exactly what makes you a co-creator of the predatory system you claim to hate.
Because waiting makes you inherently passive. It keeps you securely seated in the audience, eating popcorn, just watching the movie play out, completely reliant on someone else to change the ending.
Exactly. If you are constantly waiting for someone else to fix the macro structure of the world, you are willingly giving away your personal power. To counter this, the source advocates for highly practical, intensely localized physical solutions.
The entire philosophy is about systematically withdrawing your energy, your attention, and your capital from the massive global machinery and reinvesting it entirely into your immediate, tangible reality.
The actionable advice he gives his audience is surprisingly grounded and deeply challenging. He says, stop voluntarily giving your money to the massive multinational corporations you complain about.
If you hate the influence of BlackRock, Vanguard, and the global elite, why are you mindlessly buying all your processed food from the giant supermarket chains they hold massive stakes in? Stop it.
Go find a local farmer, shake their hand. Buy your meat, your eggs, and your vegetables directly from the person who actually pulled them out of the earth.
He extends this concept of personal sovereignty into the professional realm as well, doesn't he?
He advises his listeners to ruthlessly evaluate their employment. If you are working a corporate job that forces you to compromise your morals, that drains your soul, or that contributes to the system you oppose, you have a moral obligation to leave that toxic environment and build something independent.
But perhaps the most surprising and heavily emphasized piece of advice in the entire interview relates to human biology.
He is incredibly passionate about physical fitness. He essentially looks at his audience and demands, why aren't you in the gym lifting heavy weights 3 to 5 days a week?
It seems so completely disconnected on the surface. What does doing a deadlift have to do with fighting a biometric digital ID? But within his framework, it is the central pillar of rebellion.
Because the entire philosophy is about becoming physically, mentally, and spiritually robust. The logic is brutal but clear. You absolutely cannot protect your family in a time of crisis. You cannot inspire your local community to break free from the system, and you certainly cannot endure the immense physical labor required to build an alternative, self-sustaining agrarian lifestyle if your body is weak, chronically sick, and entirely dependent on the mainstream pharmaceutical industry to function.
In a world designed to keep you sedated, sick, and dependent, getting incredibly strong is the ultimate act of political rebellion.
It is about actively building a parallel economy and a parallel society while the old system collapses. And the source makes a point to highlight that this is not just abstract internet theory. This community is actively organizing in the physical world.
Right. The interview heavily promotes an upcoming project called MVO 2026.
In the Dutch corporate world, MBO usually stands for Maatschappelijk Verantwoord Ondernemen, which means corporate social responsibility, the kind of ESG, green transition metrics the alternative media despises. But in this context, they have co-opted the acronym to mean something closer to socially free enterprise.
It is a masterclass designed specifically for awake entrepreneurs who want to learn how to build resilient businesses entirely outside the traditional multinational-dominated corporate structures. They are teaching people how to trade outside the digital panopticon.
They also heavily promote the physical gathering of their community through art and media. The interview discusses the premiere of a newly produced documentary called De Stilte Schreeuwt,
Which translates to The Silent Screams?
This is a highly polished professional film focusing on the deeply controversial issue of excess mortality and vaccine skepticism. But what is truly notable about this project is not just the film itself, but how it is being presented.
They didn't just upload it to a fringe video site, did they?
No, they rented out the Pathé Tuschinski, one of the most prestigious, historically significant, and mainstream movie theaters in Amsterdam, to host a massive red carpet premiere.
Wow.
Furthermore, they are not just screening the film to an echo chamber of agreeable fans. They are hosting rigorous live panel discussions following the screening that include both victims of the medical establishment and fierce critics, alongside actual establishment figures, such as a representative who worked for the Ministry of Health.
They are actively, aggressively trying to force the conversation out of the digital shadows and into the physical light. They're demanding a seat at the table in physical spaces, refusing to just scream into the void of social media algorithms.
If we pull all of these actionable steps together and connect them to the broader philosophical picture, what Jorn Luca is ultimately advocating for is a masterclass in shrinking your locus of control.
Shrinking it. That is the key distinction. Not expanding your influence to save the world, but actively shrinking your focus.
Correct. The concept is deeply rooted in ancient Stoic philosophy, the idea of separating what is within your control from what is outside of it. When your mind is hyper-focused on the geopolitical machinations occurring in the Strait of Hormuz, or you are obsessing over the exact verbiage of a treaty being drafted by the World Economic Forum in Davos, your perceived locus of concern is massive, encompassing the entire globe.
But your actual tangible agency in those arenas is exactly zero. You cannot personally stop an aircraft carrier from deploying. You cannot rewrite a United Nations climate mandate from your living room. Staring at those massive, unmovable objects only generates a profound sense of powerlessness, crushing anxiety, and ultimately, that black pill despair we discussed.
But if you consciously choose to shrink your focus away from the global stage and redirect that exact same energy toward your own immediate backyard,
you regain total, unshakable agency. You cannot control the global supply chain, but you have absolute control over what you choose to eat for dinner. You cannot control the monetary policy of the central bank, but you have absolute control over whether you spend your euros at a massive conglomerate or at the local butcher.
You cannot control the pharmaceutical industry, but you can control your physical health, your diet, and your discipline in the gym. You can control how you raise your children. You can control how you treat your neighbors.
The radical underlying philosophy presented by the source is that if enough individuals simply pull their energy, their money, and their attention out of the global matrix and focus entirely on becoming intensely self-reliant, physically strong, and locally connected, the grand, tyrannical systems of control will simply starve to death.
Those systems are parasites. They rely entirely on your daily participation, your consumer money, and your constant state of fear in order to function. If you withdraw the fuel, the machine stops.
That is a remarkably empowering place to land. So, to summarize the incredible, expansive journey we have been on in this deep dive, we started with the profound psychological shock of the Truman Show metaphor, that terrifying, destabilizing moment when the boat of your perception hits the painted fiberglass sky and you realize the institutions you implicitly trusted are functioning as a manufactured set.
We explored the deep-seated analytical fears that the directors of this set are intentionally orchestrating global crises, ranging from foreign wars to engineered energy shortages, in order to execute massive wealth transfers and construct an inescapable biometric digital prison.
We looked at the profound cynicism toward the traditional political process, examining the belief that elections are nothing but pacifying theater, and analyzing the rejection of supposed populist saviors like Donald Trump, viewing them instead as pressure relief valves designed to keep the public asleep.
But out of that incredibly dark analysis, we found an unexpected, highly practical resolution. A deliberate pivot away from global anxiety and fatalism, moving toward localized physical power. We explored the paradox that the grand technocratic script of the elite might inevitably be derailed by the very chaotic, deindustrializing forces they unleash, forcing humanity back to a simpler, more grounded existence. And we detailed the actionable philosophy of building a parallel society through local commerce, physical strength, and community resilience.
And this brings the entire conversation directly back to you. Whether you listen to this exhaustive breakdown and find yourself agreeing with every single layer of this grand conspiracy framework, or whether you listen to it and completely vehemently reject it as dangerous speculative fiction, there's an undeniable, deeply challenging truth embedded in their final conclusion that demands reflection.
It is the fundamental truth of radical, uncompromising personal responsibility. We exist in a modern society where it has become incredibly easy and almost expected to outsource our basic well-being to massive, faceless systems. We outsource our baseline health to the pharmaceutical and medical industries. We outsource our daily food supply to fragile, multinational agricultural conglomerates. We outsource our sense of safety, our moral compass, and our hopes for the future to politicians we only ever interact with through glowing screens. We spend hours agonizing, debating, and stressing over vast global systems that we have absolutely zero ability to control, while completely and utterly neglecting the immediate backyards that we can.
It makes you wonder if the ultimate, most effective act of political rebellion against a massive, digitally connected, terrifyingly complex global system is simply to plant a garden in your yard, go lift weights at the gym, and start a genuine face-to-face conversation with your neighbor. Is it possible that the cure for our modern paralyzing anxieties is not about figuring out how to fight the system at all, but simply learning how to outgrow it? Think about that the next time you step outside and look up at the sky. Thank you for taking the time to join us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives, keep exploring the deeper mechanisms of the world around you. We will see you next time.